All right, I heard the voice. We're good.
We're good.
Excellent. So thank you, Sheila, for the introduction, and Patrick, the task force, for hosting this call and for inviting me here to present. Super quickly, Spring, we're a centrally funded project with USAID focused on nutrition in the first 1,000 days. We provide technical assistance to countries around the globe. We are directly implementing and have country offices in 7 different countries. And also back here in DC, we provide a lot of different research and technical assistance capacities across agriculture, nutrition, anemia, behavior change, and a, let's say, emerging area we're calling nutrition systems. So just very briefly, that's what we do and what we're focused on. Point two, everything that I'm going to be discussing today represents a pretty massive team effort. And I want to make that clear. So I get to do the talking, I think, because of my effusive voice modulation, but otherwise I'm really just giving you a chunk of this KM culture story that I'm just a very small part of. I think this will take about 15 minutes to go through, and it's very information dense. So what I want to suggest is for you all to pay pretty close attention to what you're hearing, jot a couple notes of what's most interesting as I'm talking, where you don't hear enough background or things like that, whether things I've mentioned resonate with you directly. I basically feel like I'm going to put a lot out on the table in a short time and need people to react to it so that we can make this a fruitful conversation. So it's kind of a thing where see if we can see both the forest and the trees today at the same time. Um, I also have some materials that I'll be referencing during the presentation that come from the trainings we did, and I'm really happy to share these with the group who's present today. But I have to request that if we do share those, that they're not made public in any way. We don't have approval to like share them out widely. There's branding issues and such. But that being said, I'd be happy to work with the task force to get them to a point where we can share them potentially as a tool if it seems like they're relevant enough. So with that, let me start my presentation, like all good presentations, with Kevin Costner here in Field of Dreams. He was a corn farmer, or at least he owned a lot of corn and was near a farm. I don't remember which. But in any event, Mr. Costner hears a mysterious yet compelling voice, and he becomes, as you can see in the picture below, both pensive and action-oriented while backlit by a sunset. And before you know it, he has brought forth an army of angel baseball players from decades past, becomes the talk of the town, and has a good time. And so, to review this extremely brief story, basically, if you get inspired and you follow through on a plan, you will come out ahead. This is what they tell us, right? But let's revisit the if you build it, they will come, right? I'm thinking this might not always be true. And to bring this down to our current chat on KM culture, we at Spring, let's say we were been inspired to make a lot of different guidance, but that is not always used or even often used. More generally, in the past, it's been difficult to get deliverables out. It's been difficult to turn them around in a short timeline and be efficient about them. Perhaps because some processes remained unclear, perhaps because those processes weren't followed or respected. There was a culture previously of just doing reports, whether they're 70 pages, 20 pages, 15 pages, and just having that be the public representation of our, technical activities. Our website was looking fairly slim, even though we were well into project year 2. And we had strange situations such as major 100 plus page documents like community training manuals that were being laid out in Adobe Illustrator. I kid you not. That was a very interesting thing. So with those challenges in mind, where are we today? Very happy to report we contrast some of those challenges with what's happening today, which is that, for instance, we have enough content on our website for tertiary navigation and even some interactive data features. We have our many of our KM costs estimated and fully embedded in our work plan activities for the entire next fiscal year. We have a document submission platform that is also embedded in our activity tracking report system, so people can use the internal intranet here to submit all of their documents through our copy editing, content editing, etc. We have revamped our deliverable process and simplified it and made it more clear. We're in the middle of developing a lot of new technical and marketing materials, and most importantly, and the focus of this particular presentation especially, is that I'll say we had 2.25 project-wide trainings in 2014 that were all around getting everyone together behind sort of a more KM-focused approach. So beginning with this first sort of quarter, let's say, training, we had a project-wide visioning strategy retreat back in September of 2013. There's 3 days very happily, let's say, locked together in a large meeting room. And as part of that effort, a small team of us was asked to rapidly prototype a quote knowledge hub approach to our website as a way to kind of boost Spring's overall ability to both synthesize and promote all of the technical material, all of the research, the assistant, et cetera, that we were doing. The idea ultimately fell flat. It was very new. It sort of came out of the blue over the course of those 3 days. But it was something that had never been approached before. And what's interesting is that I think it got people asking a little bit about, well, something like that, how would we budget for it? How would we take this sort of KM idea and specifically budget it? There were additional concrete discussions about how to embed KM level of effort, KM time in individual work plans and alongside individual activities. And so looking back for me, this isn't really a KM training per se, but I think, at least in my experience with Spring working on the KM, it was an area where we started to get a good hard look at how to integrate sort of this KM mindset. Or was that actually the beginning? Let me introduce to you this idea of the KM Jamboree. And this was a training that took place in March of 2014 and took potentially incredibly boring subjects like publications processes. And we actually entertained, and yes, we in fact educated over 25 people on the project. And in fact, this training was given such priority that our project director was actually very angry at one of the other senior management people on the project because he got too busy and couldn't come. Like, she visibly got upset. It was kind of impressive. In this jamboree, we covered the basics of what our KM quote shop could provide. We talked about our sort of individual skill sets as people in communications, in publications, in knowledge management, in online events. And then we delved a lot into a quote web first mentality. And I have to give a shout out to our web manager, Daniel Cothran here, for coining that term, including things around strategic communications, around social media, even around basic writing and editing guidelines and good things to follow as people were putting together research reports, around online meeting capabilities that we had, around data visualization capabilities, and also some follow-up to key messages around the vision of the project as a whole that were left over from the fall 2013 retreat. Now, the big elephant in the room throughout this whole thing was the publication process, which has always been, and to be fair, in some degree still is, a confusing thing for a lot of people. And that, I think, does include even us on the KM team. But we spent close to 2 weeks beforehand making and updating our publication process into a very pretty internal document, trying to be as specific and as codified as possible, even down to the level of who do you CC throughout the process, about estimated turnaround times, who's on a review committee, what a pre and a post USAID document should look like, all of these types of steps. And then one of our KM gurus, John Nicholson, who works down in North Carolina, flew up and actually boiled that thing down into a 25-minute presentation and really nailed it. We essentially took a 3-page, 22-step process. I kid you not. I don't know what your publications processes looks like. And we turned them into this 4-step process, at least on paper, just as a way to try and get people around the idea of their distinct phases around planning your deliverable, your document, whatever it's going to be, interactive web feature, around discussing it with your team and revising it, around what happens and how it goes to USAID, what it looks like when it goes there, what it looks like when it comes back, and then how you actually finalize the thing and get it ready to be public and disseminated. We really kept things as lively as possible. We had to. A 22-step process around publications can be institutional, bureaucratic, and really boring. So we put a lot of effort into thinking about how to keep the training itself very active and inviting people. And we handed out points and had small contests just for Starbucks cards and really just kept people engaged with the content. It was also at this time that we learned that no other project at JSI, and this seemed to be the case with the KM task force too, had ever had this kind of an opportunity, 6 hours to work across the entire project. And to be fair, I don't think anyone, on Spring goes around citing these 4 specific uh, publication part bits, but we had the entire team in there and got to explain it to them. Again, maybe that wasn't actually the beginning. Maybe this is the beginning of KM culture at Spring, or perhaps it's more a follow-on to the previous one, and really most likely it represents both. As I think I mentioned before, Spring implements in 7 countries currently. Now, this year we flew 5 of the 7 country managers here to DC for a yearly face-to-face, which lasts approximately a week. Our director of country initiatives, and this is an individual who sits here in DC but supervises essentially the portfolio across those 7 countries, came to KM and gave us a full 7 hours of time with all the country managers. And this is huge. Again, the one time of the year we have all the directors of country programming across those 7 countries, across Asia, across Africa, coming here with technical teams and others competing for FaceTime with them. We were given essentially the cornerstone of that entire week. And asked to come up with essentially a strategic communications workshop. So not KM writ large per se and internal processes about how to manage and synthesize information flow, but really going into the strategic communications piece. And again, this seemed totally rare across JSI at the least. Our delivery really needed to be around defining the Spring brand, say visually, technically, in print, on the web, and essentially trying to make the case that part of a country manager's job involves maintaining a strategic communications approach so that technical work and accomplishments are appropriately seen and correctly attributed to their work, to the home office supports, etc. What you see there are just a few of the agenda points that I've taken out. So we sort of began with a pitch, that first one about why should you care about strategic communications. We actually had a scenario where if at the DC level and at the country level we had been more coordinated about how we represented Spring, we probably could have gotten some additional funding. So that was sort of the story to say, this is real, people. This is something we need to be thinking about. We talked about branding and messaging and visual guidelines. Again, we had a whole half or hour-long thing on strategic communications itself. We went ahead and did the web first mentality thing again. And then at the end, the popcorn presentations, each of the country managers were asked to actually present on a strategic communications framework that they put together throughout the week. What you see here is something our web manager cooked up as part of his strategic communications session. And he was especially proud of it because the RIP down in the bottom right there and the RFP riff even got his wife to laugh, and he was particularly proud of that. So in this piece of the presentation, we covered branding and marketing, we covered strategic communications at the country level, covered owning the country web pages, and how different services through KM could support all of that. And all this was couched in a framework that looked at how our project technical expertise might not get recognized at the time when funding, programming decisions were being made, unless we were targeted about presenting ourselves to our stakeholders in a coherent way that reflected their own needs. And I want to say that after these 7 hours together, we actually tallied up about 35 individual follow-up steps to be, that are ongoing at this point, essentially, of how to better support the country aspect. So all of the country managers left with a draft, and to be fair, it's very drafty, strategic communications framework, which is broken down just into its main components here. The concepts are really nothing new to anyone who's worked in communications or even in KM. But the idea was that we needed to teach to something practical that could have an output by the end of the week with the country managers. And we did, as you saw on the agenda, make them present for 7 to 8 minutes on what they put together throughout those 7 hours, throughout those 5 days together. And we did have, in fact, one of our main USAID Global Health colleagues WebEx in to listen to and to view these strategic communication presentations, and seemed very pleased by having been able to do that and offered constructive feedback for us. This is a huge opportunity. And then in addition, our director of country programs actually ended with exhortations towards all the country managers saying, we will act as the brand police from here on out. I don't know whether that will actually happen, but he was pretty serious about it. All right, so let's start breaking some of these trainings and these accomplishments and progressions down into how and why it happened. And I want to start talking a little bit about sort of facilitators and barriers, let's say. So I think first of all, very importantly, our current project director really loves communications. And in fact, sometimes this annoys us because she comments on everything we try to produce and we get a lot of feedback from her, maybe more than we would like even, but it's all very good and very relevant. The director of country initiatives who I was talking about before, he is fully behind KM now. And has branding at the center of his brain. Literally, he talks about it quite a bit. I don't know if this was always the case. I wasn't really involved in a lot of KM conversations prior to June of 2013. The project's been active since late 2011. But I think that 2013 strategy session did help to open those doors. And also to note at the talking about the project director and the director of country initiatives. Before that, we had a lot of interim project directors, frankly, and I do wonder if sort of those transitions sort of left something to be desired in terms of how KM was represented in the project. There are deliberate attempts to link KM with deliverable timelines now, as with our activity tracker and with the document submission duo, which admittedly has some kinks, but this is something our web manager, again, is regularly revisiting and trying to make adjustments and support. In 2013, Spring received an add-on contract from the Bureau of Food Security that had KM written into its scope. It said to do webinars. It said to maintain a group on AgriLinks, which is a knowledge platform supported by the Bureau of Food Security. It said to do short, targeted practical briefs. So this obviously forced our ag nutrition team, of which I'm a small part, to focus on those types of outputs very deliberately. But I think it's fair to say that same focus has likely bled out across the project kind of incrementally, and even at this point is bleeding out into the KM task force, is bleeding out into conversations I have with some of our communications directors here at JSI. And just as an interesting point of fact, my time is actually split 50-50 across the ag nutrition team, focused on KM things, and then focused on KM across Spring as a whole. So I'm sort of, in a way, sort of an individual representation of how that scope of work that was focused so much on knowledge management has been transferred a little bit into Spring writ large. Now, on the downside, we still get swamped. We have successfully made KM seem more important over the past year and more needed over the past year, but frankly, we haven't actually been able to expand our team versus what we had in 2013. Also, in a way, we have so much guidance and process stuff available, it becomes difficult, I think, to regularly enforce it given the size of our team. So overall, it makes for a scenario where it's a little bit tricky for us to stay ahead of the curves in terms of sort of this enforcement piece, and also, frankly, in terms of a workload piece, especially in September when everybody's trying to finish up their work plan activities. I think quality control remains an issue, again, with the workload, and also eats up a lot of many people's times. Myself, our CAM advisor, our communication coordinator, everyone is involved in QC, in quality control. And even at this point, it ends up being done by technical team folk rather than us, or by a lot of outside editors that we interface with. And even with all this difficulty, it actually still remains difficult to argue for more in-house capacity around editing, especially around design, around web support, et cetera. And that's sort of a conversation we revisit frequently right now, especially as we're going into fiscal year 15. So the net result, unfortunately, is that KM, I think, can still be seen on Spring as a difficult process and as a difficult team to deal with. So that's another thing that we always try and address head on. But it's a fact of the matter, and be interested to hear your thoughts on that later. So with sort of those facilitators and barriers in mind, how can we maybe take away some steps that people can consider taking, or things that maybe we've practically done to get to where we are. So we're still pushing, and we're still pushed, I think, on several levels around like clarity of guidance, around document submission, around the time of our publications, editing, layout. And a lot of that stuff's still up for discussion. But I think our KM successes are based on the context of the project. I want to make that clear. So we have our own barriers and facilitators, and I'm trying to draw out some general ideas here. They come from gaps recognized as things are falling through the cracks, just as they come from people on our team being very proactive and meeting needs before they become critical. So some ideas, the first one's actually a very personal one that I like to do, and that's kind of set aside some KM brainstorm time. And in fact, for me, I like to do it by myself or in a very small team, kind of have no strict agenda and only loose objectives that I think are always maybe jumping around in our head of, oh, I'd really like to do this, or I have this idea or that idea, but given the day-to-day task, you never really fully flesh those out. But this is a chance, I think, to go into your calendar and physically mark out an hour on a Friday where you're pretty relaxed and go and think about those things. And how do I accomplish X? How do I reasonably do that, or take a small action so I can go towards it? And just take the time to figure out not only how you can address those challenges, but also who you need to talk to in order to start to get it done. Are you seeing, this is going back, are you there just in the forest, among all the trees, or can you see that entire forest and where you would like to go? And I think it's important to have time for both. Number two, leverage your colleagues. Sort of in support of the first point, you may not always be the one to pitch a key knowledge management idea to the powers that be. So if you see something that needs to be done, also at the same time, think about who you can convince, whether it's above you, below you, horizontal to you, who can eventually, through different means, get to the ear of a decision maker and a planner who will be able to have like an impactful action around that. Enforce. This goes back to things I was discussing before, but if you're making new guidelines, do you know who will bother and actually take the time to slap people on the wrist when those guidelines are not followed? It could be you, it could be someone above you. I like the example, our current communications coordinator now sends very kind emails for people who have not used the document submission form. So when she gets an email with an attachment for a rough draft of deliverable, she says, oh, thank you very much. Could you please go back to the intranet and submit this to the document submission form? And what do you know that's actually working? And in fact, it's also shown a few shortcomings of our document submission system, or places where it's confusing. So it's also great for a web manager because he gets additional feedback and can go back and iterate and improve on that. Thing four, which we've been doing for a long time here on Spring, we directly link our knowledge management and our technical teams. We physically sit in with our technical teams in their hour-long, weekly or monthly meetings, whatever they are. So the idea is that essentially you try and get a KM perspective from the beginning on reports, on deliverables, et cetera, that they're doing. Saying that, ultimately, we want all of our efforts and activities to be used, to be digested, and to be applied in the best way possible. So making a point that the KM sort of lens is going to help all of that and help to package the information from the get-go. I think is key for making those kinds of linkages. And then this is really hard, maybe in part because it sounds so simple, but even within the KM team, who is the lead on different pieces, right? Who is the lead on dissemination? Who is responsible for the constant contact account? Who is the webinar guru and go-to, and who's the backup if the guru is out traveling to Guatemala on a TDY? Who sits on what country team? Who sits on what technical team? So I think this is always a struggle for us, but the better we articulate our own tasks, the more coherent KM looks to the entire project, actually. And I think because of that, the more we get to chip in a few words when they're most useful. And then the last one I just added in shortly before finalizing this presentation, and comes from a discussion over brunch with a colleague Emily Forsyth Queen, who I think some of you know. She works at University Research Center or Research Corporation. And she was making the point that in talking with her project director was essentially told more or less that the potential that she sees on her project around KM are actually too advanced for where the culture and where the planning, where the project currently is. And so it's a question of what do you do in that case, you know? And I don't have a quick answer for it for sure, but my gut says that's a point where you focus more on how to shift things over 1 year or over 2 years down the road. But again, that's a really poor answer for, you know, in her case too, if the project itself only has a year left. You know, how exactly do you promote good KM culture if there's really not the time to do it? So again, just to revisit the beginning, if you build it, I think you can say that yes, it will have been built, but you know, all the barriers and facilitators that we were discussing and those points that I was just trying to elaborate on are the things that are going to say whether or not people will actually come and use the things that you've built. So with that, thank you very much for your time. I put up a few what I thought could be discussion questions. Patrick or Sheila, if you have different things you'd like to discuss, please do. But otherwise, thank you again for your attention.
All right, thank you, Aaron. That was excellent. So I just kind of want to go. I just want to let you know a couple other people joined us in the room. We have Julie McCarthy with the Bureau of Food Security. We have Eric Fernhaber, that's it, from FinTrack, and Jamie Holbrook, my apologies, from FinTrack also. So, and I see a few more people join us online, so that's very exciting. So yeah, I want to go ahead and have us about 15 minutes of some questions and answers for Aaron, or just kind of general discussion. Did anyone want to start us off, either using one of Aaron's proposed questions or something that just struck you during the presentation? Go ahead and shout it out. Don't be scared.
I guess I'll jump in and go first. Nobody else. So actually, a question that I had kind of coming into this that you kind of hinted at here and there, Aaron, and sort of gets to number 2 up here on the list around kind of defining roles and that sort of thing. But I was wondering too, if even taking that a step further, if you found any kind of recurring activities or trainings, perhaps, as you mentioned, or sort of what kind of processes can you start to instill that will help build that culture of knowledge management?
So different processes that'll help promote promote a knowledge management culture on the project.
Yeah.
Or that you mean that sort of like got us to the point where we were. Could you clarify that? I'm not sure. Trying to like that got us to the point where we were able to, you know, have these trainings. You mean, or where we were able to kind of, you know, align KM, LOE, and activity tracking, or what?
I guess in looking at kind of barriers, the question 2 that's up on the screen, barriers or facilitators. Not thinking about my project or organization, but one thing that I think it sounds like was useful is having these trainings or some kind of regular recurring activity that would reinforce the culture of knowledge management or knowledge sharing. So you find trainings a big portion of that, or what other activities might also be good?
Gotcha. Cool, thank you. So the trainings, I think, to me, they represent both. They're both a process that reinforces the culture, and they're also born out of interest in creating that culture. And I think once you get to the point where you're able to have these kinds of a training, I mean, I think I mentioned this, but we put a lot of effort into actually making those things, you know, not just relevant for people, but actually entertaining, because the worst thing you can do is have a shot at, let's say, building your KM culture and getting people more behind why a deliverable process is important, or why it's good to think of a web first mentality, or why all, you know, these approaches to making a good product, or good in, you know, being good at information synthesis and capture. But if you don't make that pitch well with your own project, you know, up in front of them on that day when you have 3 hours, 4 hours, or whatever, then it might just be more of a lost opportunity than anything. And then in terms of things that got to the point where you can train, or just different processes to consider, I mean, it's really, I don't know beyond the support we get from like our project director and from our global initiatives director, I mean, those just those feel very huge to us, right? And in a way, we lucked out, I think, with our project director overall because she came in with more of a comms background. Um, and just and I don't know how to, build that in otherwise, except for, just going back to the old adage, if you kind of meet people where they're at. And if you think, for me, like if I went to another project, I wanted to have a greater KM culture, and I wanted to be able to get technical people thinking more about how their research and activities are going to, be put forth in a way that people are going to read or interact with or use or apply. It would be a matter of going to the leads of those technical teams. It might be working with the technical researchers themselves. It would be working with their managers and figuring out ways where arguments, especially that are going to advocate for why these things are important, whether it's because it's more efficient for the team overall, whether it's because it's a higher quality of product you produce, whether it's because it's a more, you get better return on investment if you figure out a way that you're linking your research directly with the dissemination, you're well targeted with your writing and your audience and all that. Those would be the things that I would kind of look at most.
Next person has a question. Okay. Julie has one in the room.
Hi, Erin. It's Julie.
Hey, Julie.
Hi. So you mentioned that at one point you were faced with a contract that kind of forced the smaller team to do CAM tasks.
Yeah.
Such as webinars and short briefs and such. And
yeah.
Of course, from USAID's perspective, we are writing CAM into more of our contracts, which is a really great thing. We're adding those deliverables in there.
It worked.
Yeah, so I was excited to kind of hear about that working. But I'm wondering if that, that's not necessarily equivalent to a CAM culture. And also, we've had trouble in some cases with some contracts where, they're giving us those 6 blog posts we asked for, but the quality isn't so great. Or they themselves do a webinar when they're totally not ready to do a webinar.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering about the interplay with that.
Those are super good points. Because if you start essentially mandating, webinars, blogs, meetings, events, etc., how do you make sure that the people are equipped to, do those at the quality that's really required for it? I mean, so I guess there's definitely a few ways to look at this. One was, I mean, from the point of joining the agriculture nutrition team, which is where the CAM was embedded in that contract. The person who is Heather Danton, who's the director of the ag nutrition team, she kind of got it. She, is not someone with a huge CAM or comms background, but was able to read into it that, okay, these things are hugely important. We're going to be responsible for them. We're going to be measured on them. We're going to be funded based on them. And so she made sure to hire some people who had done this for a while, and namely John Nicholson, who had already worked with JSI for the previous 5 or 6 years. So I think for her it was, okay, this is an important thing. We got to get the staffing behind it. And then I don't recall exactly how all of the discussion went down, but there was definitely a point where, as she was making her team, right, she had to argue for how much KMLOE she was allowed to have in the budget, essentially. And I don't recall what the original proposal was, but I think, in fact, she wanted both John and myself full-time just under agriculture and nutrition. But ultimately, I'm sort of, like I said, I'm kind of split. So I spend 50% of my time just focusing on the ag nut team. So I'd say, in part from a contractor perspective, it's a lot about making sure that there's the funding available to support the staff that's going to give high quality outputs. And then, from the team perspective, just seeing that we're going to be held accountable to that kind of stuff. I mean, it, necessarily gears our work plan and gears our thinking, towards getting high quality products out the door. Is that at all useful, Julie?
If I could jump in here, this is Sheila real quick. I think Julie makes a really good point, is just because in an RFA you say you need to have 6 blog posts and 3 webinars doesn't mean exactly that people are collaborating, people are learning, there's actual knowledge exchange going in there. So it kind of speaks to, I think that KM is not an add-on, but it's an actual technical area where there's skill and where there needs to be time invested and resources, so that these things can be developed so people are actually talking to each other, learning from each other, and not just checking off boxes on a list. So
I think there's I think there's a couple of, this is Patrick, I think there's a couple of other things too. I mean, to what end are we doing KM? I mean, are we just doing it for KM's sake? Are we just putting on webinars to do webinars? What's the strategy behind it? And I think that's something that, like all of us could benefit from making sure we're paying attention to in our projects and we're doing. And then the other thing that strikes me is, Aaron, a lot of what you've been talking about is KM and the KM staff, like the staff that are working on KM. But how do you show the value of KM to people whose job isn't KM, or who might not even have much, if any, KM written into their job description? So getting it so that it's an organization-wide thing where people just see KM as a value and as something they should be doing in its different forms.
And so that we don't have to do everything ourselves. But I sometimes get this feeling like USA is really getting gung-ho about KM, but they think that means bring everything to Julie so that she can something for us to do. It's like they want a deliverable, Jamie, that a piece of content, and they said, okay, well, we provide some material, facts or a very raw story or something, and it comes to us. Should we, is it better to say, okay, just give us that raw material and we'll deal with it because we know we'll do it well? Or it's better to sort of hope that they can do a good story, or teach the tools, but not but let them handle the content. Or how do we empower others? It probably depends on, I guess, who's that. But different every situation.
Well, I really love the idea of the Jamboree. It sounds like it sounds like a really clear way to show people, like a show and tell, right?
Yeah. No, there's a lot. I mean, even the funny thing is that it was, again, our project director who used the term KM Jamboree. Everyone was coming to me and like, Aaron, that was totally you, wasn't it? You're the one who said KM Jamboree. Like, no, not me. This is your director. Like, but I mean, that's why I know it sounds silly, but why we spent, I think, so much time trying to make it just like having an element of entertainment and really engagement in there. Because again, this is, if you start boiling down into a 22-step deliverable process and who to, CC on an email to USAID versus when it's only internal, that gets fairly boring fairly quickly. So you have to find a way to keep people engaged and recognize the importance of, like, if we follow this better, the KM shop, let's say, as a whole will be more efficient. We will turn things around faster for you. It will be more clear where things are in that process. You can go focus on your work more rather than checking on us and getting frustrated with whether it's at a copy editor or a content editor. And that also for me ties into the idea of like how to get people behind this idea of like, if you develop a good KM processes across the board, it's about, about efficiency. I think a lot about efficiency, and then, the entire part that I didn't really get into of like, information capture and synthesis and all of that. But this is, I come at this, I guess, from this kind of practical, and as you were saying, Patrick, like staffing standpoint almost, just because it's these things that regularly come up as, the barriers and facilitators to making the KM culture here at Spring. In my experience, those are like the arguments that are most compelling for people.
So I guess my question, which you're kind of touching on with these trainings or other interactions with non-KM people, is how much are non-KM people involved or engaged, I guess I should say, in creating processes, having feedback in KM processes versus being told what these processes are, and just do they just want to know what to do? Do they just want you to tell them what to do, and that's what's going to make their job more efficient? Or is it more helpful to engage them a little bit and help them or bring them into developing the product?
I'd be happy to hear answers to this question from other people for sure. Yeah, right. I think so. Definitely personally, and I think it's fair to say in our experience, it's better to be reaching out to people as these processes are being developed and double check them and get input, especially from the people through which those processes are most likely to be, enacted essentially. So the example I would give is prior to the country managers meeting, and this goes back to discussions around developing our website more. It's very hit or miss how well and how often content is coming from our country programs, to DC in a way that we can package and put it up on the website, whether it's, something, a short 100-page blurb about an activity, whether it's a photo gallery, whether it's a longer, report that we can put into HTML and post, these kinds of things. So we were trying to think through ways to make that type of engagement more regular and to basically, put it into a process, make people responsible for it, and give numbers around how frequently these things need to be done. And so we had someone, it was actually a very high level, he was technically an intern, but I mean, he's a brilliant guy, was here and was working on KM for a few months this summer, and he got tasked with doing that draft. And then very quickly, it brought in, it was himself, brought in the web manager. We brought in the bulk of our country support staff back here in DC, worked this thing, revised it in with, I would say, a group of like 8-9 people feeding back on it, especially on the countryside, and then put that process in front of two different, manager level or director level people here to make sure that they were comfortable with what we were suggesting. So I think there is that, that definitely helps create a sense of ownership and buy-in. Now, all of that being said, we did roll this out at our country managers meeting, which was just back in August, which I was referencing. And we have not yet had time to actually follow up on whether that's going to be implemented and making sure people are following that process. I think it will happen, but again, it's just, back to again, tied into the barrier of how big your team is and how much time you have to devote to things. We took the effort to create this process, so we really want to get behind it because we got a lot of buy-in, but we haven't been able to sit down and have a review with the country support team again following the country managers meeting yet. So that's coming up this Friday, actually. It was a full, month behind when this thing was first rolled out.
All right, does anyone have a last question or comment for Aaron?
Well, I was just thinking in response to that last one, just from the top's perspective, I know some ways that because I'm often trying to get people on our team to adopt new practices or a new tool or a new way of doing things. And I mean, if it's a KM question where we're going to implement something KM focused that affects the entire team and that they're all going to have to do, then sometimes, we'll have a conversation with all of them. So it's like bringing them in early and getting them engaged, but not overwhelming them because,
yeah.
We don't want them to feel like they have to be dragged along in this process that they might not ultimately care that much about. But, they might have a certain amount of time that they can devote to it. And so we'll engage them at kind of like the level that we're feeling out and that we think is appropriate. Where they feel like they're meaningfully involved. But then sometimes we're just trying to get them to adopt some kind of new tool. And a lot of times in that sense, I'll work with one person on my team who's a champion, who's really into this new technology that we want to incorporate, who's willing to work with me to test it out on a first run. And then from there, we can kind of solidify, a rough sketch of a process that we're going to use around implementing it. And then we take it out to the rest of the team. We show them kind of what we created, what the outcome was, get them kind of excited about this new tool or process, and then at that point, maybe get their feedback, but just try to start to reel them in one by one. And so maybe it just, just to answer your question or to respond to it, maybe it also depends on the type of challenge that you're facing or the type of thing that you're trying to get them to integrate. Because for me, certain approaches, it makes sense to approach somebody one-on-one and get them to, help figure out a process and then take it to the whole team.
Right. No, definitely. I think that's good. Just tailoring how you go about approaching people with those types of tools to, yeah, I think the champion idea is fantastic. And how do you think, has that been successful for you, Patrick?
Yeah, it's definitely helped us to get a couple of things out there and get people thinking about tools in new ways. It's kind of like the whole show and tell thing. Like people, if you're talking about something and they don't know what it really looks like,
Yeah.
after then they get, they're worried about it. They don't want to invest time in something that's might not work out or might not turn out in a way that's valuable to them or the people that they're working with. But if you show them how it's been implemented and it's interactive and cool and it gives them ideas around topics that they could take and package in certain ways and then send out to the community, then you generate more excitement. We've definitely seen some success around that.
All right, well, that's great. It's been a great conversation. Something we're all interested in. Erin, thank you again. And once again, if you have any more questions or things you'd like to put on, always there's the Knowledge Management Task Force section on the FSN network. You can go ahead and I know Erin's on there, so feel free. Erin, I'm volunteering you